There was a time when people paid actual money for a sound that lasted about 7 seconds. Not the entire song, just a tiny slice of it that played when somebody called you. And for a long time, that was a real thing people cared about.
Yeah, check this out. Word. This is the bomb. Listen.
TV. That's what makes ringtone culture so strange to look back on now. It was one of those little trends that felt completely normal at the time, but in hindsight it's kind of ridiculous in the best way. People were spending money to personalize their phones with snippets of songs, sound effects, and themes, and somehow it felt like the height of personal expression. Which is funny because most phones are silent now. If you hear a phone ringing in public today, it's almost considered rude or suspicious. Like somebody forgot to update their settings sometime around 2011, and now everybody in the room has to deal with it. But there was a whole era where the ringtone was part of your identity, and that's what makes this whole thing kind of interesting. Because ringtone culture wasn't just about the sound, it was about status and taste, like a very specific kind of early mobile pride. When cell phones first started becoming common, people wanted them to feel personal. Phone wasn't just a tool, it was a tiny object people carried around everywhere, and one of the first ways people figured out how to make it feel like it was theirs was by changing the sounds it made. It sounds simple, but it hit at just the right time. In the early 2000s, especially, phones were becoming more visible in everyday life, and that customization started to matter more. Ringtones were one of the easiest ways to show off. You could have a silly tone, a weird sound effect, a catchy little melody, or one of those chopped up versions of a song everybody immediately recognized. It was a very early version of digital self-expression. Not exactly deep, but deeply of that era, so to speak. And because this was the early mobile age, ringtone culture also had a weird little business ecosystem around it. You had commercials advertising ringtones, you had ads in magazines and on television, you had people texting numbers to get a download, you had songs sliced into tiny pieces for no reason except that somebody somewhere decided this was a market, and for a while it worked, and people really did buy them. That part still feels kind of insane to me. Not because the idea itself is bad, it's actually a pretty good one, but because it shows how different the relationship to technology was back then. We were excited enough about cell phones that we wanted to decorate them, and ringtone culture was one of the first big signs that the phone had stopped being just a phone. It was becoming a personality object. You could look at someone's ringtone and make a judgment about them in like 2 seconds. That guy is the default tone? Oh, he's boring. And that person has some loud novelty sound? They're trying too hard. That kid has a weird little version of a pop-punk song? Obviously, peak civilization. It was low stakes, but it still felt expressive. And honestly, it's probably why it stuck around as long as it did. Because ringtone culture existed at the intersection of technology and vanity, which is basically where a lot of trends live when they're young. People want to show that they have the newest thing, or at least a customized version of it. Your ringtone was one of the first little pieces of digital identity that ordinary people could control without needing to know anything technical, and that made it easy to understand and easy to sell. And then there was the music angle. Ringtone was really one of the first ways people could basically carry a tiny branded fragment of pop culture. It wasn't the whole track, just like a recognizable little piece that made other people say, oh, I know that song. Which is kind of funny because the entire point of music is usually the song itself, but in ringtone culture, the fragment was enough. Sometimes it was even better than the full song, well, at least for the moment. It got the reaction without the full commitment. That's probably the best way to describe the whole era, basically. A lot of ringtone culture was about getting the reaction without needing the full experience. And then smartphones kind of changed everything. Once phones started becoming smarter, sleeker, and quieter, the whole thing began to fade. People stopped thinking about their phone as a toy to customize and started thinking about it as a device that should disappear into the background of everyday life. A ringtone suddenly felt less like a feature and more like an interruption. Ringtone culture didn't really die in some dramatic explosion, it just quietly evaporated. The phone itself became more important than the sound it made, and eventually a lot of people stopped bothering with custom ringtones at all. Most people now leave their phones on silent or vibrate or do not disturb. If a ringtone plays in public, it kind of starts to stand out, which I think is a little perfect because ringtone culture was always tied to a really specific version of the phone era that doesn't really exist anymore. Back then, the phone was still a novelty in everyday life, and now it's the infrastructure. I think that's why this topic is more interesting than it might sound at first, because if you say ringtones out loud, it sounds like a tiny detail, but when you actually look at it, it tells you a lot about the era. It tells you how people thought about technology, how early mobile culture got monetized, and how quickly customization became part of identity. It also tells you something about the internet and consumer culture in the 2000s. That was a time when it felt normal to pay for digital little extras. Screensavers, wallpapers, ringtones, all of it. Today it sounds a little silly because we're used to getting endless free customization options built into apps and devices. But back then, buying a ringtone felt like a legitimate purchase. It was a way of saying, I would rather have the cool version of this thing. And like a lot of 2000s trends, it was kind of dumb, but it was also kind of charming because it was pretty sincere. Nobody was pretending a ringtone would change your personality. It was just a fun little way to make your phone a little less generic, and that's pretty human if you ask me. You would think something that tied together phones, music, and self-expression would stick around longer, but it turned out to be a very much of its moment. Once smartphones made it easier to personalize in other ways, and once phones became more about notifications than calls, the ringtone lost a lot of its purpose. People still remember them though, not just because of the sounds. They remember the commercials, they remember those weird little websites, they remember trying to find the right snippet of a song. They remember the embarrassment of a ringtone going off in class or at the movies or another place you really didn't want the attention. And that memory is part of the charm now. Because ringtone culture isn't just nostalgia for sounds, it's nostalgia for a phone era that felt more playful, more physical, and a little less invisible than the one we live in now. Back then, your phone announced itself. Now it mostly tries not to. And maybe that's the biggest difference of all. The ringtone era was loud in a very small way. It made people care about one tiny sound that represented them, and for a short window of time, that tiny sound mattered enough that people paid for it. It's kind of amazing. Not important exactly, but amazing. And honestly, that's why ringtone culture is worth talking about, because it's one of those small, weird trends that says a lot about the world it came from. It reminds you that before smartphones became our default everything machine, we were still figuring out what phones were even supposed to feel like. And for a while, the answer was make it ring like your favorite song, which, when you think about it, is a very strange and very specific thing to have been obsessed with, but that's the internet for you.